If you're just joining us, welcome to the Science Behind Retention webinar today. Thank you so much for being on with us today. My name is Brandy Arnold. I am the Chief Customer Officer at Wayfinder, overseeing supports for our partners across the nation and internationally as well, and just engaging out in our school districts with people who are implementing supports for their teachers and educators and students, and folks who are behind the research of that, like the folks that I have on with me today. So Hallie and Chris, thank you so much for being on with me today. I'm really looking forward to elevating your perspectives, your voices, and your research on this topic today. I wanted to just give you both an opportunity to introduce yourselves as well. So we'll go ahead and start with you, Hallie, if you want to just give a quick introduction about the work that you do.
Sure. Hi, everyone. Great to be with you all. Today, I'm Hallie Fox. I'm head of research and co-founder at Educators Thriving. I began my career as a special education teacher and administrator, working mostly at the secondary level. And when I went to grad school, I thought I was interested in exploring student well-being. And what I quickly learned was that a lot of students' experiences are informed by the adults in buildings. That was certainly relevant for myself as a classroom teacher and administrator. When I started digging into that literature, what I realized is that a lot of the focus was on educator burnout, and not a lot of people were asking, how do we actually support educators to be well and sustain this profession? So spent some time digging into that and have the chance to do that now with Educators Thriving, where we really focus on supporting the adults in schools and school systems to be well so that they may achieve their goals and outcomes with students. So we offer a lot of professional development direct to educators on strategies to increase personal well-being. And we do a lot around school and system-wide measurement to understand how staff are experiencing their workplace, and then work with leaders to identify some key opportunities to shift the work and think about how we keep people and keep them well in our school buildings. And I get to do a lot of wonderful collaboration with Chris, who's also here with us today.
Hi
Fantastic. Thank you so
everyone.
much.
Good morning or afternoon. I don't know where everyone is throughout the nation today, but it's morning here. My name's Chris Evans, and I'm a social psychologist and researcher. I mainly work at the Stanford Mind and Body Lab, where I focus on the role awareness and mindsets play in our health, well-being, and performance, kind of at a global level. And I look at it across a few different domains, including education, but it's not my just main focus, but education, athletic settings, organizational settings, clinical settings. And while I focus on the individuals, I always consider the context in which they're nested in. And so this could be considered like the immediate context in an environment in the moment, but it also includes the social, cultural context, and even historical context. And so all of these factors shape how we think, act, and feel. And I'm usually thinking about it from the perspective of how might we go about empowering folks to kind of harness our own capacity to not only build individual well-being, but systems and environments that also promote community and collective health and well-being.
Hmm. Thank you both. And I'm really excited to hear more about the research. There's so much coming out of Stanford, especially Chris. It's definitely research that we've referenced often in our work around well-being. I want to take a moment to do some context setting because when we talk about well-being, there's different perspectives, there's different modalities and how people are addressing this. And so I want to just make sure that we're kind of defining it for our conversation today. So I'm just curious to hear from you both. When we talk about educator well-being, or when you talk about educator well-being, um, what do you mean by that? Kind of give me a little bit more of a definition, especially through the lens of those contexts, Chris. And what can folks misunderstand about well-being? And Chris, let's start with you.
Yeah, I think that's a good question. I mean, and there's probably two ways I'll answer it. One, at a high level, well-being is a multi-dimensional construct. So it's not a one thing, it's a variety of things. And I'll bring it back to that. But I'll focus and zoom in on a little bit of just like educator well-being. People are often thinking about it as maybe a feeling, right? A state like positive emotions or happiness, or, even the opposite when folks are feeling burnout. But even burnout is not just some simple thing. It involves emotional exhaustion, for example, physiological exhaustion, or people just often attribute it as if it's like a self-care problem. Well-being is a self-care problem, but
Take a
it's
bubble
kind of,
bath.
yeah, exactly, which, I can be helpful, but that's just one little piece. And so the science paints a more dynamic picture of well-being. And so how I've been thinking about it, and um, Hallie, maybe she can share a little bit about, for example, the construct in which we went about validating and kind of way of thinking about well-being. But at a high level, I think about well-being as adaptive capacity. So it's the ability to kind of meet sustained demands in ways that protect health, meaning, and effectiveness over time. I mean, if you're not able to show up as your best self over longer periods of time, I just don't think you're likely going to be feeling your best, showing up as your best, other people receiving you as your best. And so I think about it more. It's like, what are all these factors that can help us show up as our best self in these different environments, in different contexts, as an educator, as the parent, as the sister, as the daughter, as the brother, as your own self who's like, yeah, I need a bubble bath today. That's what's going to really help me. Some folks need to pause and often even just think about what are those things that really contribute to their well-being across these different domains: physical, emotional, spiritual, psychological, social, behavioral. All of these things reflect and contribute to well-being.
And what do you think folks might misunderstand about that when you think of the
Oh,
complexity and the layers? I'm curious for
oh
your
yeah,
perspective
yeah.
on that
Good
before
thing
we
you
move
brought it
ahead.
back for that.
Yeah.
Missed that one, but that's a good question. That's a good question specifically. And there's a lot of different responses, but for me, I think about it as like one thing I think a lot of folks misunderstand about well-being is that it's about eliminating stress. And so teaching is inherently meaningful and demanding. It's really stressful. And so when I think about well-being, I think about more as like, okay, what kind of stress systems are we creating? Are they ones that deplete people, or are they ones that people can metabolize, learn from, and even grow within? Because on the flip side, turns out stress is part of learning, growth, transforming our minds, our bodies, our experiences, leveling up in who we are. So they're part and parcel of actually developing higher forms of well-being. So once again, people think about, oh, I got to de-stress, I got to get rid of stress. That's my well-being. When that's just not true. Humans were always nested in environments that are extremely stressful. And in fact, from the day you come into this world, the social world, it's extremely stressful, and the stress shapes you. Your parents are stressed about bringing you into this world. In fact, the biophysiological, social, environmental stressors that they were exposed to impacts you in the womb, which then you're now exposed to stress for your whole life. So it's not something we avoid. So to continue on that, but it's something we can integrate. It's something we can utilize more deliberately.
Thank you for that. And Hallie, how about from your perspective?
Sure. So thinking about the context of educators specifically, a few years ago in partnership with the American Federation of Teachers, they were really curious to learn. There's a lot out there around educator burnout, and often we might receive a PDF with recommendations like taking that bubble bath or drinking water, and that's probably all good, but is that what we mean? Is that what we really characterize as educator well-being? So to answer that question, we actually spent a lot of time, about 100 hours, with a wide range of educators across the country, teachers, custodial workers, librarians, social workers, asking them what contributes to well-being in their workplace specifically. There are a lot of definitions out there of workplace well-being, but not really specific to the role of being an educator, and we know that that is unique. So what we learned from that, and from all of those conversations with educators and through some statistical analysis that we did in partnership with Chris, is that one, we can measure it. We actually can definitively say that educator well-being can be measured. And two, as Chris mentioned, it's multidimensional. It's not just one feeling or one thing. There's actually 7 key predictive factors that really make up this construct of educator well-being. And what people are sometimes surprised to hear is that most of what explains educators' workplace experiences is actually informed by the context that they're in, by their school site principal and leadership. The extent to which people feel that their school site principal, their administrators are responsive and supportive. Leaders set the tone, and that can sometimes feel like a heavy weight on school principals, but in the same way that a teacher sets the tone for a classroom, a principal and administrator does the same for their staff. So that's one really key component of educator well-being, coupled with some of the key foundational supports available in a school organization or district, like compensation or staffing opportunities. And there's also a number of key mindsets and dispositions that contribute to educator well-being. The extent to which we're able to accept challenging situations or adapt to the inevitable things that come our way. How can we prioritize our own well-being in addition to our professional responsibilities? And do we continue to have a growth and learning orientation towards our work? So that kind of holistic definition really encompasses there's the social environment, the leadership, culture, those foundational supports. And there's also these key mindsets and dispositions that we individually bring. And what really excited us about this definition and this model is it means that there's a lot of opportunities to intervene. We can support school leaders and districts and organizations and thinking about how to prioritize and drive positive culture. And we can work with individuals to think about, what are our own mindsets? What are our relationships with stress? What are we doing to make sure that we're showing up in the best way possible? And we know there's a ton of research between, adult regulation and students regulation that there's really this important relationship that when adults are well, we're able to show up and do our best work with kids.
Thank you so much for both of your answers. And I'm hearing a lot of the same themes that we talk about at Wayfinder as well, in terms of there's positive stress, there's also negative stress, and that it is multifaceted. And so, as you're working with, and then Chris, I also heard you mentioning a key piece is sustainability over time. And so there's these like quick things where folks are like, we'll have a staff appreciation day, and like for the next couple of days, folks are feeling good, but is that sustainable over the long haul? And so, as you all are working with administrators and educators on the kind of holistic systemic support, so both the in terms of the multi-factors, both the culture and the larger structural pieces, but also the individual mindsets. What are you hearing from administrators and educators right now, especially about like why this topic is so incredibly important in this moment?
I think a lot of districts, school sites are worried about retention, making sure that they have a sustainable staff. A lot of people are looking at the pipeline and realizing that we might not have the line at the door that we once did for people signing up to go into education. And retention often is the best recruitment strategy. We want to create work environments where people are excited to be. They see themselves as, able to do that over the long haul. And a core component of that is creating that positive workplace culture. When we talk about responsive leadership and supportive culture, it's not just the false positivity or that one potluck or appreciation day. Those things are nice. But it's really about the ongoing relationship, the sense of trust that I can, you know, work out challenges that I'm having with students with my administrator. We can problem solve together, that, you value my opinion as an educator, that I know that my requests will be responded to. That it's really about an ongoing sense of collaboration and teamwork, that we're in this together, that my administrator has my back. They trust me to do my job. The occasional gratitude note, again, appreciated. But what I think teachers are really looking for is the reliable, responsive support from their administrators. And just as, school staff are looking for that, administrators also have an incredibly complex and demanding job. And they want to have, the latitude and agency to create that culture at their school site as they are managing multiple demands from their district, from the families they're working with, from the students and teachers that they support. So really it goes down to how are we creating a strong collaborative culture where decisions, you feel like your voice matters, you feel like you're a part of it, that if you have a challenge, somebody is there to support you.
Absolutely. One of the key things I heard is voice. I want my voice to be heard. I want it to be trusted, and I want to feel like my administrator has my back. Absolutely. And I think those are really key things as we think about the more systemic supports. I want to dig a little bit more into the research. So when we think about the research that you all are working on, what does it mean for educators to truly flourish in a system? And not just avoid burnout. We're not just kind of hoping folks don't teeter over the edge, but we really are wanting to create the climate and the systems to support flourishing. So what does that actually mean? And what is the research telling you all? Chris, let's start with you.
Yeah. So I might bounce around a little bit on this one, mostly because I want to also touch and kind of connect it to your last question. So what I'm hearing and seeing a lot, one, I think humans, especially kind of across the board, but especially in America, we're starting to prioritize well-being as a part of what we do, how we want to experience the world, and not just prioritize everything and everyone else. And so to zoom in more specifically, what I'm hearing and seeing also from educators is often like this lack of agency, um, maybe cultural coherence. You can think about that in a certain way. We can dive deeper into that, but also meaning. And so educators are
Mm,
feeling like they're working incredibly hard, but they're inside systems that they have less voice, as you're alluding to, less support, and less sense that their effort is actually translating into impact. And not only that, more and more people want to shape their profession without contributing meaningfully to the community or appreciating the work and the foundation that educators bring, but people are more often blaming systemic community social failures on these individuals. And so this is part of the context and the challenge that I'm hearing and seeing. And so there's definitely room for improvement, which requires a broader perspective. And so, from a social psychological perspective, this combination is really potent and dangerous, meaning high demands, low perceived control, low collective and cultural support. And that's exactly when stress starts to become toxic rather than motivating. And it can, we saw a mass exodus, of course, around 2020, 2021, 2022 from educators, and it's continuing as, Hallie was alluding to, maybe this lineup, which was already a high turnover profession, a high stress profession, maybe folks aren't going to continue to go into it just blindly. And so we need to take a step back as a nation, as a culture, on like how are we thinking and approaching educator. And being an educator is one of the most stressful jobs. And so when people don't feel rewarded, they leave. Surprise, of course. And so uh, it's now becoming more baked in with anxiety and stress and depression, which is common not only within educators, but that's been growing across the board. So wanted to tie that into your question right around the research and the kind of what flourishing actually is and how we um, approach that. So you can think about flourishing, of course. Well, maybe not, of course. You can think about flourishing also as a multidimensional kind of thing. It's certainly related to optimal human functioning. You showing up as your best. And it's not just the absence of mental illness, for example, or physical pain, or it is the presence of, high levels of function. These are happiness. This is life satisfaction. This is emotional and psychological well-being. It's like thinking about it as like living a good life. You have growth, you have purpose, you have engagement with stuff outside of your job as well. That's important. And I like to think about flourishing to also encompass resilience, which is a separate but connected construct. Where you can think about resilience as being able to adapt. The process of adapting when you're faced with adversity. Could be trauma, tragedy, significant stress, the daily, everyday grind, for example. And it's essentially your ability to bounce back. And so, to me, when we're flourishing, we're able to bounce back and we're also able to integrate and experience purpose, growth, belonging, know your impact. All of these things contribute to me when folks are showing up at their best. And so often when you're focused on burnout, you're asking this question: how do we stop the burnout, the bleeding, the issues? And really, to me, it's stepping back and saying, what conditions might allow our educators to feel more effective, more connected, more meaningfully engaged, even when the work is hard? Because the work's going to be hard. Um, And that, to bring it all back to the science, all that stuff matters because first off, these things flourishing, for example, they predict retention.
Mm.
You know, it predicts instructional quality, classroom climate. And ultimately, these things connect, of course, to student learning and well-being. And so these systems are shaping kids at the psychological, social, emotional, behavioral, and even physiological level. And once again, those are all components of well-being. So educator well-being indirectly is shaping all of these things for the students. And so they all play a picture or a part of this puzzle when they're thinking about health and well-being.
Mhm. And what I'm hearing you say is these things such as, perceived impact or feeling like my efforts relating or translating to impact, feeling like my work is meaningful, feeling like I have agency and that there's trust there. These are not just luxuries, but these are essential, especially now in our current climate when teachers are taking on so much and facing a lot of outside factors as well. So when I think about your answer, I know that you've also done a lot of and really impactful work around mindsets. And I'm wondering if you could speak to that a little bit as well in regard to creating the conditions for flourishing, particularly
Hmm.
from a psychological standpoint
For sure. Happy to dive a little bit more into that.
and
So by
physiological.
mindsets, by mindsets, I think you can think about this as like core beliefs about meaningful areas. It could be like human personal qualities and traits like intelligence or skills. It can be about experiences like stress, or it can be around domains like around illness or the body or exercise. And so I study how these beliefs across these domains might shape at a high level health, well-being, and performance. And I'll dive more specifically because I've done a lot of the stress mindset work with educators. And this is the belief that either stress is enhancing or stress is debilitating. And it turns out most folks have the belief that stress is debilitating because it's just in the cultural ethos. Stress is bad. Go take care of well-being. Blah 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 blah. And it actually is associated with the top 10 leading causes of death. But if you look into all the literature on stress, you also see, as I said, it's not only debilitating, but it is amplifying. It literally builds us. Getting shots, immunity is an example. Exercise is another example. Like when you lift, when you run, when you lift, you're literally tearing little pieces of your muscles and you're building them again. And so stress is kind of baked in into how we develop physically, mentally, and emotionally. And so my research paints a similar picture. So educators, when they adopt this belief that stress can be enhancing, and it's not the belief that, hey, I need more stress and it's not, it's just like, let me actually take a step back and see what might be happening when I am experiencing this thing called stress. For example, it can improve your focus, your ability to regulate, and it can also dysregulate those things. So what is it that we can do to shift that? One way is changing your beliefs about it. And when people change their beliefs, we see that is associated with greater social and emotional and physiological health, like healthy coping, healthy behaviors. The stress mindset literature has even been linked to greater teacher retention, particularly in preschool, kindergarten teachers. I collected some data on educators in middle school and high school. I haven't published that data, but basically showing that over a year, it predicts retention a year later. We also see that it predicts performance, and this is across several different areas. But one of the key cognitive performance areas I'll think about is, for example, on the GRE or the bar exam, and those are students in this case. But still, we think about what happens when you adopt a particular mindset, and this stress mindset can have impact on how we think, how we act, how we feel. And a lot of educators know a lot about the growth mindset literature. This is one of my main advisor and close collaborator, Carol Dweck. She has done decades of work on growth mindset, the belief that your skills are malleable and your intelligence is malleable. And what I want to say about this is like that's has been kind of well studied. But one important thing about our mindsets is teacher mindsets directly predict student mindsets. And so a lot of the newer research on that space has moved beyond the student mindsets and relating it to well-being, behaviors, performance. We're really starting to see like what is in the environment that can shape how that student is thinking. And turns out You can directly predict student mindsets from the teacher mindsets at the college level, at the high school level, even at the middle school level. And so these mindsets were being shaped socially and structurally, both people in our environment. But when I say that, I mean, what's in the environment? Posters that highlight who can do certain things and who should be doing certain things implicitly and explicitly. Actual policy, availability, resources, talking about who is adequate, who deserves opportunity, who is up to snuff. All of these things essentially can shape how we believe and think about ourselves, which has impact down the road. And so I can dive even deeper into some of these things, but the big takeaway I'll just highlight on that is like our mindsets matter. For how we think, act, and we feel, but more important, they also matter for the folks around us. And so, as educators, how we show up, how we're thinking about ourselves, how we're thinking about our students can get infused into how the students are showing up and thinking about themselves.
Mm. Thank you so much for that. I think that that cascading effect is so important, right? So as you're thinking about as a leader at my school building or as a leader within my district, my mindset has a cascading effect down to my educators, and then the students that they're engaging with as well. And so kind of what I heard you saying, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, but uh, one of the calls to action for folks on the call today might be around normalizing stress, particularly positive stress, while also creating conditions where trust is there, where, the agency is there, where folks can begin to build flourishing rather than just keeping them from teetering of burnout. And and if that is the case, then it's not saying that we're completely removing stress, but we're creating conditions where people feel meaning. And Hallie, I've heard you kind of refer to it as where they feel excited to stay. Can you talk a little bit more about that? Like knowing that we have to in some ways normalize stress, um, while also creating conditions for flourishing. How does that relate to keeping folks excited to stay in terms of because I know people in the audience, their brain is on retention, right? Like my folks are leaving in droves. Like how might I keep them excited to stay? How does some of the research that Chris mentioned, what does that look like in a practical application?
Yeah, when you think about talking to veteran educators who are really excited to show up year in and year out, usually they're not talking about just maintaining the status quo. They're excited about new opportunities, about adapting their practice, about responding to student needs, and they feel like they have the supports to actually do so. One of the models that we pull on a lot in terms of framing educator well-being as this multidimensional construct is called the Job Demands Resource Framework. And what it really kind of suggests is that our highest chance of engagement when we're in the workplace is actually when demands are high, but so are resources. That we are meeting the demands of the job with appropriate resources to actually do those. When demands are high and resources are low, that's when we see burnout. And too often in education, that is what educators experience. And we know that certain communities, certain schools continuously, structurally, systematically experience higher demands and lower resources. So the challenge is not how do we remove the demands? Because the demands are going to be there. Working with young people is a demanding job. Public education is incredibly dynamic. How do we actually meet those demands with resources? And I don't just mean resources like classroom materials or increased compensation. Those are certainly important. But I also mean resources in terms of relational resources. Do I feel supported by my admin? Do I have a team that I can rely on? That is a key indicator of the extent to which I'm excited to stay. And then, as Chris has described, my inner resources, my own level of resilience. Educators are a resilient population. We've seen that pretty, repeatedly in our research that educators report high levels of resilience. Um, but we need to just be mindful of meeting the real demands of the job with appropriate resources, not trying to deny the fact that it is stressful. One of the sessions we often do with educators is really about normalizing some of the very predictable challenges that we experience personally in doing this job over the stages of our career in order to build connection, build that sense of, vulnerability that it's okay that we are experiencing this. It's, about how are we working our way through that? Do we feel like we are able to do that in a system that's encouraging us to do so? And as Chris has seen in his work, when we talk about learning and growth, it is because we're challenged, right? That growth happens, learning happens because we are doing something new and different, and there's something inherently challenging about that. But we want to do so in an environment that creates, those conditions so that people feel like they're not alone.
So I hear you both saying even something as simple as communications out that acknowledge the limitations and stress that exists currently in our educational system, especially because as we think about resources, sometimes the budgetary resources, those more concrete resources, that's a whole nother vertical of challenges that folks are facing. And so something as simple as an administrator just communicating, hey, I know X budget, got cut this year. I know these things are happening. Just acknowledging that these stressors are presented. I know that you have more students in your classroom this year than you did last year. Normalizing it and also saying, and I got your back. And we're all in this together. And, here I want to hear from you of ways that we could innovatively address X. Just like continuing to elevate their voices, pushing growth and creativity that we know so many of our educators have, and they come into their roles with. Brene Brown mentions is, I want people like, are you willing to get in the ring? Are you willing to get down, on the ground with the folks and say we're all in this together, while also supporting the individual mindsets of the educators? Could be a place to start, knowing that this is such large systemic work. As you all think about, especially for our folks who are attending today, and folks, please drop your questions in the Q&A. We're going to open it up to questions at the end. But if you have any questions along the way, please drop those in the Q&A box, and we're going to try to address those as we close out today as well. But for folks who are kind of, digesting this research and thinking about, where do I begin? What is one practice that you've seen that's both impactful, but also something that you can start small and then is scalable across different schools or districts? And Hallie, I'll start again with you if you want to give an example.
Sure. So I guess I'll share two, some easier to implement than others. But one thing we've seen consistently in our research, and Chris and I are working on a project now thinking about this a little bit more systemically, but one of the key predictors of educator well-being is actually reported time for collaboration. Making sure that educators have time to work with their colleagues. The job can be so isolating. You are in a classroom with a whole bunch of young people, but you very much feel alone as sometimes the sole adult. And making sure that people have structured time to collaborate and that they really do so authentically is a key predictor of educator well-being and job satisfaction. And we know that matters for retention and for student outcomes. So kind of big bucket, that is definitely where I would suggest starting, making sure that time is in place, that educators have protected time to collaborate with one another, and that's part of the school culture, the organizational culture. Something really simple that we do with a lot of sites that we work with is you have a lot of meetings over the course of the day, a staff meeting, an instructional leadership team meeting, a grade level team meeting. How can you just infuse some of those personal check-ins during all of those touch points? Give people some time to actually check in. How are you feeling? What's leading you to feel that way? Getting people to kind of name how they are showing up in spaces so that we can practice that skill of, self-awareness, self-regulation actually helps us kind of downregulate, and making that part of our standard practice. It's so easy to just jump into the agenda and the to-do list, but really just taking 5 or 10 minutes. How are you? What's leading you to feel that way? We often use the mood meter. Those of you who are familiar with Ruler, Yale Center for Emotional Intelligence, there's a ton of tools out there, ones that are adult facing with a lot of vocabulary around emotional states, and some that are student facing, as simple as emojis in terms of that. We ask kids to do this. We also need to take the time to do that as adults. It's a really simple practice that can just form that sense of connection and helpful for leaders to get a pulse on what people are bringing into the space before they dive into, an agenda.
Absolutely. That's something that we often say too, is that you can't forget about the adults in the system. So how are you starting your staff meetings? We have a full PK-12 curriculum for our students, but we're also saying if you're asking your educators to kick off their class or their advisory with a check-in, are you doing that with your staff too, in staff meetings? So what is that opportunity for that one-on-one in connection or just small group connection as well? Completely agree there. It can be just a little tweak that really changes the interactions that you're having with your staff each day. Chris, how about from your perspective?
Yeah, I might take 5 minutes to answer this, maybe more, but it's all connected. And it's how I think about it. I say if leaders did one thing, I'd say embody and build structured moments of awareness. Now, maybe I'll add a little bit structured moments of awareness, but and also meaningful social engagement into the workday. So, meaningful social engagement is this kind of social, external, environmental, critical factor that is important for retaining us. But when I think about awareness, it is both internal and external. So when I say awareness, I mean mindful awareness, which is present moment attention, temporally here in the now, connected to the environment here. And of course, mindfulness is experiencing a popularity, but across the science and just across the human experience, turns out showing up, being present, moment oriented has impact on how we show up in the moment, but also our health and well-being across every level. So I mean, like physiological at the cellular level, emotional, where we can connect it to just emotional awareness and regulation, but also cognitively, like our ability to focus, our ability to remember things and to retain information and to think abstract and think creatively. Like across the literature, this type of awareness has an impact on our quality of health and well-being and how we're showing up. So, and when I say embody and build, I mean the folks that are actually actively practicing and building this into not only their lives, but into the environment and engaging with that meaningfully, not as like a thing after, but as a thing that we truly understand, like not as an add-on, but as like this is part of our meetings. So showing up when you start a teacher staff meeting, are you starting it and are you doing it with awareness? Are you just mindlessly there? When I mean that, like, are you actually here with us right now psychologically? Are you here with us? Are you bringing your attention right back to the present? Turns out something so simple and subtle is actually really impactful. And even if we connect it to students, like you can't even learn if you're not paying attention. You got to tell kids to pay attention, but there's a skill behind that. There's ability to be that we can develop behind that. And so mindful awareness, but also say when I say awareness, I mean meta awareness. And meta awareness is our capacity to kind of pay attention to how we pay attention. And it's a psychological skill, and almost you can think about it as a flexibility in which we can start to recognize where the mind is in any given moment, including to know, is this mind here in the now? But the key quality and distinction of meta awareness is that we don't have to be temporally here in the now to move away from the scientific terms. I mean, for example, when you sit down and purposefully reflect on the past with awareness and intention, this is much different and much healthier and better than when just being accosted by the past memories popping up. Especially, let's say you're driving. Let's just say you're teaching or engaging with someone, and the conversation, something from a year ago pops up, and it continues to just pop up while taking you away from the moment. Now, that's natural. That's called being human, but it turns out that happens a lot and we can do something about it. But having us thrusted into the past without awareness and intention or into the future, which we need to do, we need to plot, we need to plan, we need to think about things. But when it's happening without your awareness and intention, this is when you're lacking meta awareness. And I'll talk a little bit about meta awareness. It's our ability to kind of monitor our conscious experiences, how we're thinking, how we're feeling, what is happening not only belief wise, but what about the body, physiological. And when you can role model this quality, this trait, you can practice it, you can embody it. Turns out it's also associated with expertise across any domain. So, give you a more specific example. If you're teaching and you know you're teaching well, you likely have some system that you're tapping back into, that you're doing it with some deliberateness, some purpose, some intention. Let's just say, man, I like to tune in and see how my students are receiving this lesson. You probably might be tuning into their emotional, their eyes, their attention. They got phones out. Like you're not just mindlessly continuing to teach. You actually are tuning in to the moment. You're being responsive and adaptive. And so when we're at our most adaptive, we have high quality of awareness. So building that in, and that can look like a lot of things. For me, it's yoga-based practices, which is a very potent way to cultivate awareness. But can be walks, could be check-ins, could be mindfulness-based practice, could be exercise, could be gratitude, but taking the time purposefully to cultivate the conditions, to set the stage for awareness. And what happens when awareness happens, so does purpose. Purpose starts to flourish by nature and it's associated with us. And so it's an essential quality, a skill, a trait, it's a way of being. And it impacts the individual, but it necessarily impacts the collective because you start to tune in to how independent and interdependent things actually are. So I'll pause
Mhm.
there.
Thank you for sharing that. I'm kind of struck and stuck on a piece that you mentioned about moments that come up from the past that we tend to, I don't know that you said this exact word, but we can ruminate on. And I think that probably is a factor for a lot of our educators and administrators. You know, something's going on with a student that is, it happened last week, but it's stuck in your mind. Or as an administrator, you had a tough staff meeting or meeting with a parent. Um, can you say more in like a practical application of how that awareness might apply in those situations where you're aware of what's happening in your mind, but then what is the practical tool that you might use to support your
Yeah.
flourishing in that moment if you're kind of feeling stuck on something that happened in the recent
Yeah.
past?
And that's even more a reason when I say a practice is like you practice these things even when you're not in other environments. So I say you take that minute to be a minute all by yourself to cultivate the present so you could show up there. And why that's important is because if I'm practicing present moment attention, you practice skills and qualities along the way. So when you sit down and you're doing some of these skills, you also start to cultivate psychological capacities. For example, things like acceptance. And acceptance, if you really dig into it, it's not just some false, nothingness idea or term. Like to some degree, you have to actually learn how to accept conditions, experiences, things from the past, things that you can't control. And it is an active quality and skill. That's just one of the things that you do. So when you sit down and you pay attention and you're practicing your mindfulness thing, you say, man, my mind is running all over the place. You don't try to push and pull away from it. You notice it with acceptance and with awareness. And you say, cool, I see you, mind. Let me bring you right back here. Thanks for trying to do what you do, which is natural. Another quality that you cultivate: patience, compassion, non-judgment. These are all important qualities that can transform how you're showing up for yourself, how you're other people. But you actually do that when you're doing these awareness-based practices. And so to bring it back to your example, so meaning that's not the first time that I'm sitting down and practicing my awareness, and my compassion. So when I notice that my mind is running right back to that difficult conversation, for example, it's easier for me to cultivate a little compassion for myself in that moment and say, hey, mind, I see you running back to, but I got to be present with the person right here. I notice you here. I can be kind to myself too. I know I was probably concerned and worrying about taking care of this parent or, making sure I show up in a certain way, but I'll set aside an actual minute or two to sit down and reflect on that actively with awareness, not just without my intention or awareness. And then it turns out it makes it easier to do just that thing. And so sometimes it doesn't work, but it definitely doesn't work if you're like, well, let me do this awareness thing when I'm already overwhelmed in a situation. It's like me asking you, I say, hey, Brandy, let's go run this 5 miles together, or let's just go do this let's do 15 pull-ups. And yet you've never done it before. It may be natural to you or easy to run because you run, but it doesn't mean you've done that thing. And so when I say practice and embody, I mean taking the time daily to do these practices because you'll start to tune in and pay attention how they show up when you're moving through the world. And so moving through the world is really what these skills and these qualities or traits are about. But if you don't
Mm,
pause and you don't sit with yourself and you don't recognize where the mind is and what it does naturally, you're just going to be caught up doing that thing when you're actually moving through the world. And so it's a really important pause and a really important, I think, quality and state of being human. And it even brings you back to the humanness in a deeper way. And you're like, how is that to be true? Well, explore it yourself and you try it in your own life. And these are things that have been around for thousands of years. And turns out they're accurate. And so you start to practice them. You start to see how they show up. I'm like, wow, holy cow. And so I encourage you to explore them in your own curiosity. Oh, curiosity, another quality and skill and trait that you cultivate when you're learning how to relate to yourself and the mind in different ways. And so these are all important stuff that contribute to learning, our well being, but it's about the exploration and embodiment of it.
Thank you so much. And I think you're like, oh, it turns out this actually works. People have been doing it for millions of years, and it's really going back to the core of the humanness of it all. There's so much flying around back and forth between federal budgets and systems and all of these things. And so what I hear you both saying is that how do we focus on how we move through the world as it is right now, recognizing that there's a whole nother vertical of work that's trying to address what currently exists and try to make some of the systems and structures a little bit more supportive. And while we're doing that, how do we center on us as individuals, as humans? How do we center on our own practice of acknowledging that you're struggling and also in that moment focusing on ways in which you can connect with a peer or just like we tell our students to do, connect with a peer, elevate your voice, feel that sense of agency, create conditions for connection, for gratitude, small moments of gratitude. How do you elevate those throughout the day? And what is the responsibility of leaders in school systems to do that? So thank you so much. I think there's a lot of different little small practices that folks can integrate
What I'll
throughout the
say just to
day.
add on that, Brandy, because I think those things exist, but people are there reactively. I think people got to understand you got to eat this stuff just like you could do it nutritionally. You don't reactively. I mean, sometimes you do, you're busy, like, eat lunch, eat dinner. But these are things you eat and you drink water. Awareness and our attention is essential way in which we experience social reality. And so we got to practice how we eat that stuff, how we bring it in, how we allow our quality of attention to be drawn out, news, cell phones, other people, but also how we're recognizing and regulating it. And it's not something reactive. It should be so proactive that we're missing how important it is that it should be embedded into educational systems. Like, how come attention is so important, but we don't train our ability to attend to our attention? Like, it's that critical, but it's so subtle that it just falls away. We don't actually teach and train these capacities. Like, people do it, people develop the skills, but it's not some intentional way across our American educational system. So I agree with what you're saying, but I'm like, people say that, but it's like, we got to think about it more like, this is what you got to eat. This is what you have to eat to even start to flourish. It sets the conditions, the foundation to flourish in your own life, but also in concert with other human beings, which once again, we are always nested within systems with other humans. And like, we have a quality of thinking in America that is like very independent oriented. And that's wonderful for a lot of different reasons, but it can also be challenging and it shapes our worldview. It shapes how we understand the world, how we move through the world. And so these
I
qualities
think
and
that's such a
practices.
Thank you for that. And I think that's such an important point, which I leads to a couple questions that we have from folks in the audience that there's a tension there. And I hear you saying this can't be a thing that we add on. It needs to be embedded in just like we're, drinking water or, I think that relates to the tension that I hear in both of these questions that's related
Mm,
to bandwidth from educators. And so, we have one question that's saying they know that they need to support their own well-being, educators do. But what we consistently hear is that they don't have the bandwidth to engage in something new. And so from that perspective, they want to focus on student well-being. Similarly,
mhm,
this other question is saying, there's just a tension between adding anything new to the plate, and teachers are like, just let me teach. So what I hear in both of those questions is
mhm,
just let me
mhm.
focus on the students. I don't have time to do anything else. If you tell me to do this new practice, my head might explode. Right.
Yeah.
And I also hear you saying it needs to be something that's so embedded, it's like drinking water throughout the day. So how do we navigate that tension as administrators?
And that's the
Um,
number one pop up for everyone, by the way,
yeah, and
educators
and
and other
in your
people.
practice as you're supporting folks, can you give me a couple examples of how you've navigated that tension with a few of your partners? And then I know we're about to wrap up here, so maybe just a minute each to start, and then we'll go from there. And if there are any final questions from folks in the audience, please feel free to drop those in the Q&A box as well. But Chris, yeah, I sorry, I just spoke over you, but
Yeah.
you said you're like, we
No.
hear it all the time. So how do you navigate that?
Yeah. And it's tough, and I think it's almost in shift in thinking as if it's like this or. And one thing I would say is like, pay attention to how you're showing up, pay attention to how often the mind is running away from the present moment, and tune into what happens when you're present. So our environment can help us be present or take us away from them. So when you're hiking, for example, in beautiful spaces, you're on the beach, it's very easy to be present. but we also have this internal capacity. And so, once again, I guess I would connect it to just tune into how you're teaching and just start to pay attention to the mind. And you might notice, how often am I showing up with quality and energy and vigor and the presence that really impacts people? When I'm present, what happens when I'm not present? So you start to realize that it's not it's integrated into what you are, who you're, how you're showing up in all moments, your relationships, for yourself, for other people. Cultivating these types of practices are important. So for me, it's almost a shift of like, I can do this, I can do this. Well, you can show up with awareness and attention right here, right now, and tune in to pay attention to how that impacts you. And so it's not a shift. And to be more specific, how I used to really do that with organizations and teachers, it was part of building this big organization where, we trained educators to integrate yoga into their own life, but also into the classroom. And I was teaching it in the classroom. And for me, I teach my students, for example, I integrate these practices into our everyday. Both I teach a class for yoga called Health, Well-being, and Performance at yoga. At Stanford. So students, freshmen to graduate students, can take a yoga class where we meet 2 times a week, where it's part of their education. It's integrated into their education. But I did that with my athletes. I do that with myself. And so it's not separate. It's part of, how do I really learn and show up effectively? Turns out I got to be eating, doing these awareness-based practices. So I know that was longer than a minute, so I'll pass it
Oh,
to
that's
Hallie.
okay. That was good. Thank you. Hallie, how about you?
Yeah, I think really, pragmatically, we spend a lot of time with administrators or district office leaders trying to figure out how to integrate this into the system. What are the existing structures that you already have in place? Your staff are already gathering at staff meetings. They already have required grade level times. You have these dedicated PDDs. How do you make sure that it's not well-being isn't one more thing? It's actually just part of what we're doing. And that can be a challenging shift in mindset for folks. But I think there's a lot of evidence that, we've talked about over the course of this webinar that how we show up directly impacts our ability to perform as a classroom teacher, right? And impacts our students' ability to really achieve their goals. When teachers have high stress, and even, there are studies that have measured teacher cortisol. You look at that in students, and it is also elevated. So if we do not do this work, we cannot achieve our outcomes with kids. When we
Hmm.
are burned out, when we are tapped out, our students are not going to be in a great place to learn. It's not an either or, it is a must. And it's about figuring out where are those existing structures so that it doesn't feel like one more thing. It's part of how we show up to do the work. And some of that is very much about individually. Am I taking the time to cultivate my own well-being? And then am I making sure that that's part of our culture, part of our team, part of the way that I want to really lead my school staff or our district organization? I think the consequences of doing that are pretty significant in terms of creating the conditions, not only for working, but also for learning.
Absolutely. And so I hear you all saying that these are not luxuries, these are a must, cascading effects down from, district administration to our part in our student outcomes. And so as leaders who are very concerned about student outcomes, how are you kind of creating that culture? What I'm just wondering, do you have any success story of a district that you've worked with that has leveraged this research, has really created the conditions to cultivate some of this well-being among the adults in their system? And what does that look like now? Hallie,
Sure.
I'd love to hear. Yeah.
Yeah, I'll share. I was one of our partners is in Boston, and we do some work with new and aspiring principals, really helping them think about like this is an incredibly demanding job. How am I personally showing up and able to sustain it? And then how am I leading towards well-being? And one of the principals started working with a few years ago, she felt like it was the first time she was given permission to humanize the work. It was like the district actively saying, this matters. The way that you show up, the way that you cultivate the sense of connectedness and belonging for your staff matters as humans. And over time, she and her team have really found ways to subtly but intentionally integrate some of these practices into their work. I had the chance to go down and visit her school last week, and it's just palpable. Like, when you walk in a school building and people are excited to be there, doors are open, people are collaborating, students are are learning, and she's seeing the results, not only in terms of staff retention, but also in terms of student achievement data over time. And I think it was really, as she has said, it was the permission to humanize the work. That, we're not replaceable cogs in the machine, that we are people who come to this profession, often for many of us as a calling, a sense of meaning and purpose. And that's really important, starting there so that we can do the hard work of supporting our kids.
Wow, I think some folks may overlook that, and to hear that something as simple as just naming and humanizing the work had such an impact on an educator. For me, I think hopefully that feels a little bit more approachable for folks, that it doesn't have to be huge to start. Sometimes just giving that permission and saying you're not cogs in the wheel and helping educators reconnect to their meaning as to why they got into this profession to begin with can be an incredibly impactful place to start. So thank you both for being on with us today. Hallie and Chris from Educators Thriving, a ton of great research that you all are working on and really leveraging that in practical ways for your district partners. So thank you for sharing your wisdom, your brilliance with us, and some concrete examples of where folks can get started. Thank you to everyone in the audience. We'll be following up with an email with some additional resources for you all, so be on the lookout for that, just to make sure that you have a place to start as you're thinking about engaging in this work in your district. I'm your host, Brandy Arnold. As a reminder, just want to say that we are all in this together. We're all kind of moving in the same direction, and for us at Wayfinder and Educators Thriving, we are just so incredibly grateful to be partners in the work with you. So thanks, everyone. Have a great rest of your day. Have a great rest of your week,
Thank
and
you.
we'll see you soon. Bye.